In the remote wilderness of Nevada, 1954, where ghost towns dot the landscape like forgotten memories, and some places exist beyond the reach of official maps, one rancher's pursuit of a cattle thief would lead him to a discovery that challenged everything he believed about community, survival, and the lengths people will go to protect their way of life. This is the extraordinary true story of how following stolen cattle led to finding something far more valuable than any livestock. Before we dive into this incredible tale of mystery and hidden communities, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you love stories that reveal the secret corners of America where ordinary people create extraordinary lives. What you're about to discover will leave you amazed at what can exist right under our noses. The desert sun was just beginning to paint the Nevada mountains in shades of gold when 47-year-old Hank Matthews discovered that 23 head of his prize Hereford cattle had vanished during the night. Standing at the edge of his northern pasture, Hank could see the broken fence where someone had cut the wire and driven his animals out into the vast wilderness that stretched toward the Oregon border. The Circle M Ranch had been Hank's life for 15 years, ever since he'd returned from the Pacific Theater with a Purple Heart and a determination to build something lasting on the harsh but beautiful land of northern Nevada. The ranch wasn't large by Western standards, just 8,000 acres of high desert grazing land, but Hank had built it into a profitable operation through careful breeding and relentless hard work. The stolen cattle represented more than just financial loss. They were part of a bloodline that Hank had been developing for years, breeding for the specific characteristics that allowed cattle to thrive in the challenging climate and terrain of the Nevada high country. Losing them would set back his breeding program by at least 3 years. But what angered Hank most was the personal nature of the crime. Cattle rustling wasn't random theft. It required knowledge of the land, the animals, and the routines of the ranch. Someone familiar with his operation had planned and executed this carefully, knowing exactly which animals to take and how to move them without being detected. Hank saddled his most reliable horse, a 12-year-old quarter horse named Scout, and loaded his saddlebags with supplies for what might be a long pursuit. The tracks left by the stolen cattle were clear in the soft earth near the creek, heading northwest towards some of the most remote and rugged country in Nevada. The trail led through a landscape that few people ever saw. Rolling hills covered with sagebrush and juniper, broken by steep-walled canyons and occasional stands of aspen trees that marked the presence of hidden springs. It was country that could kill the unprepared. But it was also country that Hank knew better than most men knew their own backyards. For the first day, the trail was relatively easy to follow. The rustlers had pushed the cattle hard, leaving obvious signs of their passage in the form of trampled vegetation, scattered droppings, and occasional hoof prints in sandy areas. But as the terrain grew rougher and the rustlers seemed to become more careful about covering their tracks, the pursuit became increasingly challenging. On the second day, Hank came across evidence that puzzled him. In a small meadow beside a spring, he found the remains of a campfire that was still warm, along with the tracks of several horses and what looked like a temporary corral where cattle might have been held overnight. But there were also signs that confused him. Fresh horse droppings from animals that appeared to be well fed and cared for, suggesting that the rustlers had access to quality feed and pasture somewhere nearby. More puzzling still were the boot prints around the campsite. Hank had tracked enough men over the years to recognize that these weren't the prints of typical cattle thieves. The boots were high quality, well maintained, and showed the wear patterns of men who spent long hours on horseback but weren't living rough. These were the prints of experienced cowboys, not desperate outlaws. As Hank continued following the trail into increasingly remote country, he began to notice other anomalies. There were occasional signs of recent travel on game trails that should have seen no human activity, fresh horse tracks, the remains of campfires, and even what appeared to be cache sites where supplies had been stored and retrieved. It was as if there was an entire network of activity in this supposedly empty wilderness. a pattern of movement and organization that suggested something far more complex than simple cattle rustling. On the third day of pursuit, the trail led Hank up a steep canyon that he had never explored before despite 20 years of riding this country. The canyon walls rose several hundred feet on either side, creating a narrow corridor that wound deeper into the mountains. About 5 miles up the canyon, Hank found himself facing what appeared to be a dead end, a wall of rock that blocked further progress. But as he studied the canyon walls more carefully, Hank realized that what looked like a solid barrier was actually an optical illusion created by the way the canyon curved. There was a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man on horseback, that led around the rock wall and continued deeper into the mountains. The passage was so well concealed that it would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Hank began to understand that he was following a route that had been used many times before, a hidden pathway that led to something the outside world wasn't supposed to know about. Emerging from the narrow passage, Hank found himself in a hidden valley that took his breath away. The valley was perhaps 2 miles long and a mile wide, surrounded on all sides by steep mountain walls that would make it invisible from the air and inaccessible to anyone who didn't know the secret entrance. But what stunned Hank wasn't just the valley's natural beauty, it was the evidence of human habitation. There were cultivated fields, irrigated pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and in the distance, the unmistakable signs of a permanent settlement. As Hank rode closer to the settlement, he could see that it was no temporary camp or outlaw hideout. There were well-built houses, a school with children playing in the yard, a general store, a church, and all the infrastructure of a thriving community. Smoke rose from chimneys, laundry hung on clotheslines, and people moved about their daily business with the calm efficiency of those who belonged exactly where they were. It was a town that existed completely outside the official world, a place that wouldn't appear on any government map or census record, hidden away in a valley that geography said shouldn't exist. As Hank approached the outskirts of the settlement, he was met by 3 men on horseback, clearly guards or sentries who had been watching his approach. They were well armed, but not threatening, and their leader was a man of perhaps 50, with the weathered face and confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Afternoon, stranger," the man said, politely but firmly. "You're a long way from anywhere. What brings you to our valley?" Hank decided that honesty was his best option. "I'm tracking stolen cattle. 23 head of Herefords taken from my ranch 3 days ago. The trail led me here." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Hank could see some kind of silent communication passing between them. Finally, the leader nodded. "My name is Samuel Pierce. I'm what you might call the mayor of this community. If your cattle are here, it's because there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Why don't you come into town with us, and we'll sort this out?" As they rode toward the settlement, Pierce explained that the community was called Haven Valley, and that it had been established 15 years earlier by people seeking to live independently from the outside world. "We don't cause trouble for anyone," Pierce said, "and we don't expect trouble to be caused for us. But sometimes there are complications when our 2 worlds intersect." Hank found himself riding through a town that seemed to exist in a different time and place from the Nevada he knew. The buildings were well constructed but simple, built from local stone and timber in styles that emphasized function over ornamentation. The people he saw looked healthy and prosperous, but there was something about their clothing and general appearance that suggested they lived according to different rules than the outside world. As they reached the town center, Hank saw something that made his heart skip a beat. In a large corral behind what appeared to be a livestock facility, he could clearly see his missing cattle grazing peacefully alongside several hundred other animals. "There they are," Hank said, pointing toward the corral. "Those Herefords with the Circle M brand." Pierce nodded calmly. "Yes, they're here. But before we discuss returning them, there are some things you need to understand about Haven Valley and why your cattle ended up here." As Pierce led Hank toward a building that served as the community's meeting hall, the rancher found himself grappling with questions that grew more complex with each passing moment. He had followed cattle thieves and found what appeared to be a thriving town that existed completely off the grid. But were the people of Haven Valley criminals hiding from the law, or were they something else entirely? The answers he was about to receive would challenge everything Hank thought he knew about the difference between right and wrong, legal and illegal, and the lengths people would go to protect a way of life they believed was worth preserving. The hidden truth. The meeting hall of Haven Valley was a substantial log building that served as both community center and courthouse for the hidden settlement. Inside, Hank found himself facing not just Samuel Pierce, but a council of 5 other community leaders who had apparently been hastily assembled to deal with his unexpected arrival. The atmosphere was serious, but not hostile. These people clearly had experience dealing with outsiders who had stumbled upon their secret, and they approached the situation with the calm efficiency of those who had thought through various scenarios in advance. "Mr. Matthews," Pierce began, consulting a piece of paper that contained what appeared to be information about Hank's ranch and background. "Before we discuss your cattle, we need you to understand exactly what Haven Valley is and why it exists." Pierce gestured to an older woman sitting to his right. "This is Dorothy Freeman, our historian and record keeper. She's going to tell you our story." Dorothy Freeman was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and the kind of intelligent eyes that suggested she had seen much and forgotten little. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived through the events she was describing. "Mr. Matthews, Haven Valley was founded in 1939 by families who were fleeing something that the outside world didn't want to acknowledge: the forced displacement of small farming communities by large agricultural corporations and government land seizures." Dorothy explained that the original settlers had been farmers and ranchers from across the western states who had lost their land to various forms of legal confiscation, eminent domain seizures for dam projects that were never built, tax assessments that were deliberately set too high for small operators to pay, and outright fraud perpetrated by land speculators with connections to corrupt officials. "These weren't outlaws or criminals," Dorothy continued. "They were honest, hard-working people who had been robbed of everything they had built by a system that favored big money over individual rights. When they tried to fight back through legal channels, they found that the law protected those who had stolen from them, not those who had been stolen from." Pierce took up the story. "So they decided to remove themselves from the system entirely. They found this valley, which was completely isolated and had never been officially surveyed or claimed, and they established a community that would be completely self-sufficient and invisible to the outside world." Hank listened with growing amazement as the leaders of Haven Valley described how their community had developed over the past 15 years. They had established their own agricultural system, their own educational system, their own governance structure, and their own economy based on barter and mutual aid rather than external currency. "We don't pay taxes to a government that steals from its citizens," Pierce explained. "We don't participate in an economic system that enriches the wealthy at the expense of the poor. We don't send our children to schools that teach them to be passive consumers rather than productive citizens." "Indeed. But we also don't cause problems for the outside world," added another council member, a younger man named Jonathan Webb. "We are completely self-sufficient. We don't take government benefits, we don't compete with outside businesses, and we don't interfere with anyone who leaves us alone." Hank was beginning to understand that Haven Valley represented something far more complex than a simple criminal hideout. These people had created an alternative society based on principles that were simultaneously radical and deeply traditional. Individual responsibility, community cooperation, and independence from external authority. "What does this have to do with my cattle?" Hank asked. Dorothy Freeman smiled sadly. Mr. Matthews, your cattle weren't stolen by thieves looking to make a quick profit. They were liberated by our people because we discovered that your ranch is about to be seized by the federal government under eminent domain. Hank felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. No one said anything to me about any government seizure. Pierce pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be official documents. Mr. Matthews, the Bureau of Land Management, has been quietly assembling a massive land acquisition project in this area. They plan to establish a new military installation that will encompass over 200,000 acres, including your ranch and 15 other private properties. The official notification hasn't been delivered yet, Webb added, but our sources indicate that the seizure orders will be served within the next 2 weeks. The compensation offered will be a fraction of what your land is actually worth, and there will be no appeal process. Hank stared at the documents in disbelief. The papers appeared to be legitimate government correspondence describing a classified military project that would transform the entire region into a restricted federal zone. How did you get these documents? Hank asked. We have friends on the outside, Pierce replied carefully. People who believe in what we're doing and who help us stay informed about threats to our community and to other independent ranchers like yourself. Dorothy leaned forward. Mr. Matthews, we've been watching your operation for several years. You run an honest ranch, you treat your animals well, and you've never caused problems for your neighbors. When we learned about the impending seizure, we had to make a decision. We could let the government take your cattle along with your land, Pierce continued, or we could save the cattle and give you a chance to save yourself. Hank was struggling to process the magnitude of what he was being told. You're saying you stole my cattle to save them from the government? We're saying we relocated your cattle to prevent them from becoming government property, Webb corrected. There's a difference. Pierce stood up and walked to a window that looked out over the peaceful valley. Mr. Matthews, we're offering you a choice. You can return to your ranch and wait for the government men to arrive with their seizure orders. You'll get a token payment for land and animals that represent your life's work. And you'll be left with nothing except the knowledge that your property is now serving the military-industrial complex that's destroying rural America. Or, Hank asked. Or you can join us, Dorothy said simply. Bring your entire operation to Haven Valley. We have plenty of grazing land, good water, and a community that would welcome an experienced rancher. Your cattle would thrive here, and you'd be part of something bigger than just individual survival. Pierce turned back from the window. Mr. Matthews, we're not asking you to become an outlaw. We're asking you to become free. There's a difference. Hank felt his world spinning as he tried to understand the choice he was being offered. Everything he had assumed about law and order, about property rights and government authority, was being challenged by people who seemed to have created a working alternative to the system he had always accepted as permanent. What about my legal obligations? Hank asked. My mortgage, my taxes, my contracts with feed suppliers? What legal obligations do you have to a system that's planning to steal everything you own? Webb replied. Mr. Matthews, the law is supposed to protect honest citizens, not enable their robbery by powerful interests. Pierce returned to his seat at the council table. We're not asking you to decide right now. Stay in Haven Valley for a few days as our guest. See how we live, meet our people, understand what we've built here. Then make your decision with full knowledge of your alternatives. As the meeting concluded and Hank was assigned a room in the community's guest house, he found himself grappling with questions that went to the heart of his beliefs about citizenship, law, and moral obligation. The people of Haven Valley had presented him with evidence that his government was planning to steal his property, and they had offered him sanctuary in a community that existed completely outside the legal and economic systems he had always taken for granted. But was what they offered freedom, or was it just another form of imprisonment? And if the government really was planning to seize his ranch, what did he owe to a system that was preparing to betray everything he had worked for? As Hank settled in for his first night in the hidden town, he realized that he was facing the most important decision of his life. A choice that would determine not just his own future, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to be free in America. The choice of freedom. Hank spent his first full day in Haven Valley, walking through the community with Dorothy Freeman as his guide, observing a way of life that challenged many of his assumptions about how modern society had to function. The settlement was home to approximately 400 people living in 150 households spread throughout the Hidden Valley. They had established a complete infrastructure, including a school that taught children from kindergarten through high school, a medical clinic staffed by 2 doctors who had chosen to practice outside the regulated medical system, workshops for blacksmithing and mechanical repair, and agricultural operations that produced everything from grain and vegetables to dairy products and meat. "We're not primitives," Dorothy explained, as they watched children attending classes in a well-equipped schoolhouse. "We use modern technology when it serves our purposes. We have solar panels for electricity, radio communication equipment, and modern medical supplies. But we're selective about what we adopt from the outside world." What impressed Hank most was the obvious prosperity and contentment of the community members. The children were healthy and well-educated. The adults seemed genuinely happy with their lives, and there was a sense of purposefulness and cooperation that Hank rarely saw in the outside world. "How do you handle people who break your community rules?" Hank asked as they visited the workshop where several men were repairing farm equipment. "We don't have many rules," Dorothy replied. "Our basic principle is that you're free to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't harm others or damage the community. People who consistently violate that principle are asked to leave." "What about serious crimes? Murder, assault, things like that?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "We've never had a murder in Haven Valley. We've had a few cases of assault, usually domestic disputes that got out of hand. In those cases, the community as a whole decides what kind of justice is appropriate. Sometimes it's restitution to the victim, sometimes it's temporary banishment, sometimes it's counseling and community service. And people accept those decisions? They have to if they want to remain part of the community." Mr. Matthews, one of the advantages of voluntary association is that social pressure is much more effective than legal coercion. When someone violates community standards, they're not just breaking an abstract law, they're betraying people they have to live with every day. That evening, Hank was invited to attend a community meeting, where residents discussed various issues affecting the valley. He was struck by the quality of the debate and decision-making process. People listened to each other respectfully. Decisions were made by genuine consensus rather than majority rule, and there was a level of civic engagement that put most outside communities to shame. After the meeting, Hank found himself in conversation with several community members who had backgrounds similar to his own. John Sterling had been a rancher in Colorado until his land was seized for a federal water project that was never completed. Mary Patterson had lost her family farm in Iowa to tax assessments that had been deliberately manipulated to force small farmers off their land. Robert Chen had been a successful businessman in California until he ran afoul of regulations that seemed designed to protect large corporations from competition. "The common thread," Sterling explained, "is that we all tried to work within the system until the system made it clear that it didn't want us. We didn't choose to become outlaws. We were forced to choose between surrender and resistance." "But what about your responsibilities to the broader society?" Hank asked. "What about contributing to national defense, supporting public services, participating in democratic institutions?" Patterson laughed bitterly. "Mr. Matthews, what democratic institutions? When did you last vote for someone who actually represented your interests rather than the interests of wealthy donors? When did the federal government last spend your tax money on something that benefited ordinary citizens rather than corporate welfare or military adventurism?" Chen nodded in agreement. "We're not avoiding our responsibilities to society. We're avoiding our obligation to subsidize a system that's designed to exploit people like us. Haven Valley contributes more to genuine social welfare than most government programs do." As his stay in the valley continued, Hank began to see evidence of what Chen meant. The community operated its own charitable programs, providing assistance to struggling farmers and ranchers throughout the region. They had a network of outside contacts who helped expose government corruption and corporate malfeasance. They even provided sanctuary to other refugees from what they called legal theft by powerful interests. But Hank's most important conversation came with Samuel Pierce, who invited him for a private meeting on his third day in the valley. "Mr. Matthews," Pierce said, as they sat on the porch of his modest home overlooking the community, "I want to address the concerns I can see you're wrestling with. You're wondering whether what we've built here is morally defensible, whether we're patriots or traitors, whether we're free men or just very comfortable prisoners." Pierce paused to light his pipe, a habit that seemed to help him organize his thoughts. "Let me ask you this. What do you owe to a government that's planning to steal your life's work? What do you owe to a legal system that protects thieves as long as they have official authorization? What do you owe to a society that treats independent citizens as obstacles to be removed rather than assets to be cherished?" Hank had been asking himself the same questions. But what about the rule of law? What about the social contract? "Mr. Matthews, the social contract is supposed to be mutual. We agree to follow the law and pay taxes in exchange for protection of our rights and property. But when the government breaks that contract by stealing from its own citizens, what obligation do we have to continue honoring our side of the bargain?" Pierce drew on his pipe thoughtfully. The men who founded this country were considered traitors by the British government. They were breaking the law when they declared independence, when they refused to pay taxes, when they took up arms against constituted authority. Were they wrong to do so? That was different, Hank said, but even as he spoke, he wasn't sure why it was different. "Was it?" Pierce asked. "They believed they were being governed without their consent, that their property was being seized without just compensation, that their rights were being violated by a distant authority that didn't represent their interests. How is our situation different?" So, over the following days, Hank found himself torn between his ingrained respect for legal authority and his growing understanding that the people of Haven Valley had created something genuinely valuable. A community based on voluntary cooperation, mutual responsibility, and genuine freedom from external coercion. The decision became urgent when Jonathan Webb approached him with disturbing news. "Mr. Matthews, our contacts report that the seizure orders for your ranch have been expedited. Government agents will be serving papers tomorrow morning. If you're going to save anything from your operation, you need to decide now." Hank felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could return to his ranch and fight the seizure through legal channels that everyone assured him were futile, or he could make the leap into a way of life that offered freedom at the cost of everything he had been taught to believe about civic duty and legal obligation. That night, as Hank walked through the peaceful streets of Haven Valley under a sky blazing with stars that were invisible from most places in the outside world, he realized that his choice had already been made. The community that existed outside all official maps had shown him something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a place where a man could live according to his own conscience rather than someone else's rules, where hard work and integrity were rewarded rather than punished, and where freedom meant something more than the right to choose which master to serve. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of moving his entire operation to Haven Valley, joining the ranks of Americans who had chosen independence over security, conscience over law, and freedom over comfort. The new beginning. 6 months later, Hank Matthews stood in the same spot where he had first seen Haven Valley, but now he was looking at it through the eyes of a resident rather than a visitor. His cattle grazed peacefully in the community's pastures, integrated into a larger herd that represented the collective livestock wealth of the settlement. His horses were stabled in barns he had helped build, and his expertise had been crucial in expanding the valley's agricultural operations. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Abandoning his legal identity and joining an unofficial community required adjustments that went far beyond the practical aspects of moving livestock and equipment. Hank had to learn to think in terms of community welfare rather than individual profit, cooperation rather than competition, and long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain. But the rewards had exceeded his expectations. For the first time in years, Hank felt truly useful and valued. His knowledge of ranching and animal husbandry had made him an important contributor to the community's success, and his experience with the outside world had proven valuable in dealing with the ongoing challenges of maintaining their independence. The federal seizure of his original ranch had proceeded exactly as Pierce had predicted. Government agents had served the eminent domain papers and offered compensation that amounted to less than 20% of the property's actual value. When no one appeared to contest the seizure, the land had been quietly absorbed into the expanded military installation, joining thousands of other acres that had been acquired from private citizens for national security purposes. But by then, everything of real value from the ranch had already been relocated to Haven Valley. Working with a network of sympathetic truckers and equipment operators, the community had managed to move not just Hank's cattle and horses, but also his farm machinery, building materials, and even some of the structures themselves. The federal government had inherited empty land, while the productive capacity had been preserved in the hidden valley. "Any regrets?" Samuel Pierce asked as he joined Hank on the hilltop overlooking the community. Hank considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed and fought the seizure through the courts." "You'd have lost," Pierce said matter-of-factly. "You might have delayed the inevitable for a few months, but the outcome was predetermined. The difference is that you'd be facing retirement with a modest government settlement instead of building something new with people who share your values." Pierce was right, and Hank knew it. The legal system that was supposed to protect property rights had become a mechanism for facilitating the transfer of wealth from individual citizens to powerful institutions. Fighting that system from within had proven futile for everyone who had tried it. But Haven Valley represented something different, a working demonstration that Americans could still create communities based on the principles that had supposedly founded the country. Individual responsibility, voluntary cooperation, limited government, and respect for property rights weren't just historical curiosities. They were viable foundations for modern life if people were willing to commit to making them work. The community had continued to grow during Hank's first year as a resident. Word of Haven Valley's success had spread through networks of farmers, ranchers, and small business owners who were facing similar pressures from government agencies and large corporations. New families arrived every few months, each bringing skills and resources that strengthened the overall community. But growth also brought challenges. The larger the community became, the harder it was to maintain the secrecy that had protected them for 15 years. There were increasing signs that outside authorities were beginning to suspect the existence of something unusual in the remote Nevada mountains. "We're going to have to make some decisions soon," Pierce told Hank as they walked back toward the town center. "We can't stay hidden forever, and we need to decide how we want to engage with the outside world when secrecy is no longer an option." Some community members favored continuing the policy of complete separation from outside systems. Others believed that Haven Valley should serve as a model for similar communities, sharing their knowledge and experience with other groups seeking to establish independent settlements. Hank found himself increasingly aligned with a third faction that believed the community should take a more active role in challenging the system that had forced them into hiding. "Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start fighting back," he suggested during one community meeting. "What kind of fighting back?" asked Dorothy Freeman. "Legal fighting back," Hank replied. "Constitutional challenges to eminent domain abuse, publicity campaigns about government overreach, political support for candidates who believe in property rights." We've proven that alternatives to the current system can work. Maybe it's time to help other people create their own alternatives. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the community about how to balance security with principle, isolation with engagement, and self-preservation with social responsibility. But the decision was ultimately forced upon them by external events. In late 1955, a government survey team, conducting aerial mapping for military purposes, photographed the Hidden Valley and its settlement. Within days, federal agents were demanding access to investigate what they termed an unauthorized civilian presence in a restricted area. The community held an emergency meeting to decide how to respond. Some members wanted to evacuate immediately, scattering to other hideouts or attempting to establish new settlements elsewhere. Others wanted to prepare for armed resistance, arguing that they had a moral right to defend their homes against government intrusion. But Hank proposed a third alternative that ultimately carried the day: voluntary disclosure combined with aggressive legal and political action. "We're not criminals," Hank argued. "We're American citizens, exercising our constitutional rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Instead of running or fighting, let's stand our ground and force them to explain why independent, self-sufficient citizens are considered a threat to national security." The decision to go public transformed Haven Valley from a hidden refuge into a symbol of American independence. Working with sympathetic lawyers and journalists, the community revealed their story to the world, documenting how federal land seizures had forced honest citizens to choose between submission and separation. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Newspapers across the country picked up the story of the hidden town that had created prosperity and freedom in the Nevada wilderness. Politicians who had been quietly facilitating eminent domain abuse suddenly found themselves facing difficult questions about government overreach and constitutional rights. Most importantly, Haven Valley's example inspired similar communities throughout the American West. Within 5 years, dozens of independent settlements had been established by people seeking alternatives to an increasingly intrusive and corrupt federal system. Hank's pursuit of stolen cattle had led him not just to a hidden town, but to a new understanding of what American freedom could mean in practice. The community that didn't appear on any official map had shown him that the most important territories weren't geographical but philosophical, spaces where people could live according to their own conscience rather than someone else's rules. Standing in the valley that had become his true home, surrounded by people who had chosen freedom over security and principle over convenience, Hank reflected on the journey that had brought him to this place. He had lost a ranch, but gained a community. He had abandoned his legal identity, but found his authentic self. The rancher, who had chased a thief into unmapped territory, had discovered that some of the most valuable things in America existed precisely because they remained hidden from those who would destroy them if they could. This incredible true story shows us that sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we follow an unexpected path to places that don't appear on any official map. Hank's pursuit of stolen cattle led him to something far more valuable: a community that proved freedom and independence were still possible for those brave enough to claim them. If this story of hidden America and the courage to live by principle inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing true stories that reveal the secret corners of our country where ordinary people create extraordinary lives. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. Remember, the most important freedoms are often the ones we have to create for ourselves, beyond the reach of those who would control every aspect of our lives. Until next time, keep believing that somewhere, off the beaten path and beyond official maps, the spirit of true independence still thrives.